I caught my wife cheating, filed for divorce, and thought I could finally move on with my life. But my ex-wife wasn't done. She stalked me and my new girlfriend, then tried to kill us both in broad daylight with her car. The story I'm about to tell is one I'd never thought I'd be living, let alone sharing. I'm 36 years old, and up until recently, I thought I had my life together. Stable job, beautiful wife, cozy home in the suburbs. The American dream in all its understated glory. But as life would have it, everything I'd built was only a flimsy illusion. When it finally crumbled, it left me with a reality so twisted and surreal that I can barely believe it myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, though. I grew up in a household where love and rage seemed like two sides of the same coin. My dad was the kind of man who believed in loyalty and family, the kind who'd do anything to keep us together, even if it meant enduring my mom's terrifying outbursts. She had a temper that could flare without warning, and he'd take every word, every insult, every plate thrown across the room, all in the name of keeping the peace. I was a kid back then, powerless, with front row seats to the spectacle of their toxic marriage. I can't count the nights I'd lie awake, hearing their shouts seep through the walls, wondering if tomorrow I'd still have a family. That was my childhood. One long string of tension and whispered words, one day praying for calm and the next for an escape. So by the time I met Rachel, I knew what I didn't want in a partner. I knew I wanted someone stable, someone who didn't have a hidden rage simmering below the surface. I wasn't about to fall into the same patterns my parents had. Rachel was beautiful in that timeless way that made heads turn. Elegant, with a laugh that was a little louder than you'd expect. She seemed bright, open, and carefree, and I thought I'd struck gold when she looked at me the way she did. We met on Instagram, of all places. It was a casual like on one of my hiking photos that started it all. But soon enough, we were messaging back and forth every night, sharing stories, memories, dreams. She was witty, confident, the kind of person who seemed to know exactly who she was, which felt refreshing. I took my time with her, 2 full years of dating before I'd even consider proposing. During those 2 years, I was constantly checking for red flags, those telltale signs that might hint at something darker lurking within. I'd watch how she treated waitstaff, observe how she handled stressful moments, take note of how she managed her money. Every single one of those things seemed like a green light. I'd think to myself, she's different. Not only was she patient and generous, but she was thoughtful in ways that caught me off guard. She'd surprise me with my favorite coffee if she knew I'd had a long day. She'd send texts checking in on me randomly. She'd even plan little weekend getaways for us. After 2 years, I convinced myself that I'd done the legwork, that I'd vetted her in every way possible. I told my best friend Joy Kai, "I've broken the cycle, man. I found someone good, someone I can build a life with." Little did I know, but that illusion would cost me more than I could have ever predicted. We got married in the summer in a little ceremony by the lake. Rachel was breathtaking that day, her laughter echoing around us as we exchanged vows under a canopy of fairy lights and flowers. It felt like the kind of day people write love songs about. We were happy. Or at least I was. The months after the wedding were like a dream. We'd cook dinner together, planning little rituals like wine and movie nights every Friday. I thought I'd found my forever. We even bought a modest house in the suburbs with a little backyard that Rachel wanted to turn into a garden. It was the first real home I'd ever had. But just 2 years in, the cracks started showing. The Rachel I knew, the one who left little notes in my lunch, the one who'd surprise me with movie dates and silly jokes, started disappearing. We began fighting, little arguments at first, the kind of normal disagreements you brush off and laugh about later. But it escalated. The tension in our home started feeling familiar, too familiar. It was like my parents' marriage all over again, a cycle of tension that I'd sworn I'd never live through. It started over the most trivial things. She'd snap at me for leaving a dish in the sink or for coming home 10 minutes late from work. I couldn't understand how someone who'd once been so patient could turn so angry over the smallest mistakes. One night, after a particularly brutal argument about the way I'd botched her favorite recipe, I suggested we go to couples therapy. I thought maybe she was stressed, that maybe we just needed to work on communication. But Rachel scoffed, saying therapy was a waste of time and money. It took weeks of begging before she finally agreed to go to just one session. We sat in the therapist's office, me gripping my hands so tightly my knuckles turned white, and her staring off into space like she couldn't be less interested. The therapist gently tried to bring up some communication issues, suggesting that perhaps Rachel's approach to conflict might be a bit abrasive. That was all it took. Rachel erupted, accusing the therapist of attacking her, calling her a quack, and storming out of the room. She refused to go back, claiming I was trying to make her look crazy. I later learned that her father had recently passed, and I tried my best to understand that grief can make people act out. But she wouldn't open up, wouldn't seek help, just kept getting angrier and more distant. The fights continued, and her temper only got worse. Rachel never got physical, but her screaming matches could wake up the neighborhood. It was unbearable at times. And then one night, it hit me that I was living in a shadow version of my parents' marriage, the very thing I'd feared most. The same way my dad had held on, hoping things would change, I was holding on to the memory of Rachel as she had been, hoping it was a phase, something we could work through. Eventually, we settled into a strange kind of routine. We were like roommates who sometimes shared a bed. I would come home from work, exhausted, and she'd be there, either scrolling through her phone or out with her friends. We barely exchanged words most nights. I'd ask about her day, and she'd give me a one-word answer, brushing me off as if my presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. Despite everything, I kept clinging to those early days. I kept hoping that if I just tried hard enough, we could go back to the way things were. What I didn't know was that Rachel had checked out of our marriage long before I did. 3 years into our marriage, my company sent me to a conference out of town. It was the kind of mundane business trip I'd taken a dozen times before, a 4-day expo full of schmoozing and PowerPoint presentations. But halfway through, I got a call from my boss telling me to fly home because of an emergency back at the office. Excited by the idea of surprising Rachel, I booked the next flight, even stopping to buy her favorite purple orchids and some chocolates. I was ready to bring back a spark to our marriage, to maybe even restart the flame that had once burned so brightly between us. I pulled up to our house, feeling like some character in a romantic movie, ready to sweep my wife off her feet. As I walked in, I could hear her favorite playlist echoing through the halls. It was strange. She usually saved that playlist for special occasions, or when she was in an especially good mood. I noticed there were 2 wine glasses in the sink. I told myself she'd had a friend over, anything to brush away the pang of doubt creeping into my gut. But when I walked up the stairs, I heard sounds that made my blood freeze. And in that moment, the reality I'd been so carefully holding on to shattered around me. I pushed open the door, and there she was, tangled up with another man in our bed, the same bed where we'd once shared dreams, whispered about our future, the bed where we'd built a life. The look on her face wasn't one of guilt or remorse. She looked irritated, as if I'd ruined her afternoon plans. Her first words to me weren't an apology or even an explanation. She glared at me and said, "You weren't supposed to be back." I couldn't even process it. I was standing there, flowers in hand, watching her with another man in the space we'd shared, the space I'd thought was sacred. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold on to the flowers, and they fell to the floor, purple petals scattering like the pieces of my heart. Her lover bolted, scrambling to grab his clothes, looking like he couldn't get out fast enough. I didn't even stop him. I just stood there, watching as my marriage disintegrated in front of me, piece by agonizing piece. When I finally found my voice, I asked her, "Why my ba?" Rachel laughed, not a nervous laugh or a laugh of apology, but a cruel, biting one. "I asked you for an open relationship months ago," she said, her voice full of disdain. "You said no. You don't get to control me." The words felt like a slap. She'd asked once, drunkenly, half joking, and I'd thought nothing of it at the time. I'd said no because I'd believed in the vows we'd made to each other. I believed in loyalty, in trust. Apparently she didn't. She told me she had needs that I wasn't fulfilling, that she'd wanted to do this without hurting me. The audacity of it. She actually blamed me for catching her in the act, as if I'd been the one who'd broken us. As if I'd violated her by showing up unannounced in my own home. The next hour was a blur. I remember standing in that room, barely able to feel my legs as she launched into a tirade about everything she thought was wrong with me. The flowers lay scattered across the floor, trampled beneath her lover's hurried footsteps, and it felt like a cruel metaphor for everything we'd once had. When I could take no more, I walked out, feeling like I was underwater, like every step was pulling me further and further away from the life I'd thought was real. That night, I stayed at my friend Jake's place. I told him everything, and he listened without saying a word, his expression a mixture of shock and anger. He was the one who pushed me to document everything, to get a lawyer. Jake had been through his own messy divorce, and he knew how brutal things could get. The next day, I called a divorce attorney. The irony was that despite everything, I was still financially better off than Rachel, which meant that in our state, she was likely to demand alimony. Even though she'd been the one who broke our vows, the law could still reward her with my money. It felt like insult on top of injury. I decided to focus on gathering evidence. I went through every text, every message, every scrap of proof that would show the courts just how unfaithful Rachel had been. The texts she sent me after I left that day were a goldmine. In her rage, she'd laid out every dirty detail of her affair, sending me paragraph after paragraph comparing me to her lover. Each word was like a new knife twisting in my gut, but I saved them all. I'd need every word if I wanted to walk away from this marriage without having to bankroll her betrayal. Weeks passed. Rachel did everything she could to stall the divorce. She'd skip meetings, claim she was sick when we had appointments, refused to sign basic documents. It was clear she was trying to make this as painful and costly as possible for me, as if she were punishing me for her own mistakes. I was burning through legal fees and patience, but I stayed the course. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. In an attempt to distract myself, I tried dating. I downloaded every app I could find, went on more bad dates than I care to admit. Most nights I'd come home feeling emptier than before, a hollow shell trying to pretend he wasn't shattered. It wasn't until one particular Saturday that things began to change. It was a gray Saturday afternoon, one of those chilly fall days that makes you want to curl up with a book. I hadn't done anything for myself in a while, so I decided to revisit an old hobby and headed downtown to a small indie bookstore I used to love. I walked in, breathing in the comforting scent of old paper and fresh coffee. The shop had barely changed over the years. Same wooden shelves crammed with books, a sleepy orange tabby curled up in the front window. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of peace. I wandered aimlessly, letting my eyes drift across the covers until I found myself standing in front of the science fiction section, feeling strangely lost. When I was younger, sci-fi had been my escape, but I hadn't kept up with the genre, and every book looked foreign. "Need a recommendation?" a soft voice asked beside me. I looked up to see a woman with an easy smile and a warm, curious gaze. She was holding a thick paperback that looked more like a weapon than a book, her thumb absent-mindedly stroking the spine as she waited for my response. "Yeah," I stammered, a bit embarrassed by how out of my element I felt. "It's been a while. Any must-reads?" She grinned, launching into an enthusiastic rundown of her favorite series, and before I knew it, we were sitting in two worn armchairs in the corner of the store. Her name was Sophie, and she had this effortless way of talking about books, her eyes lighting up every time she described a plot twist or a character she loved. I found myself laughing, nodding along, forgetting everything for the first time in ages. For a couple of hours, it felt like I was me again. Not the jaded, recently betrayed version of myself, but someone who could actually enjoy the world around him. When we finally wrapped up our impromptu book club meeting, I worked up the courage to ask for her number. My heart was racing as I handed her my phone, feeling like a teenager again. She gave me her number with a smile and said, "Let me know what you think of that book." As I walked out of the bookstore, the three-body problem in hand and her number in my phone, I felt a strange new energy surging through me. It wasn't like the hollow attempts at connection I'd made on dating apps. This was different, real. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and I texted constantly, our conversations ranging from book recommendations to random late-night musings. She was different from anyone I'd ever known, thoughtful, honest, and curious about life. She wasn't afraid of my past. In fact, she listened without judgment. When I told her about my ongoing divorce and Rachel's behavior, she just nodded, saying, "We all have baggage. I'd rather know the real you than some cleaned-up version." Our first real date was dinner at this quiet, out-of-the-way restaurant. I remember watching her across the table, her face glowing under the warm light, as she recounted an embarrassing story from her childhood. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my wine. It was easy with her in a way I'd forgotten relationships could be. There were no mind games, no hidden agendas, just two people enjoying each other's company. As the weeks passed, Sophie became my anchor. I'd spent so long walking on eggshells with Rachel that I'd forgotten what it was like to just be myself. Sophie reminded me of the parts of myself I'd lost. My sense of humor, my curiosity, my hope. Every time we were together, I felt more and more like the man I used to be, the man I wanted to be again. But even as I started to feel happiness creeping back into my life, Rachel was determined to keep me tethered to the past. While my relationship with Sophie blossomed, Rachel was pulling every trick in the book to stall the divorce. She dodged court summons, forgot to bring essential documents to meetings, and threw out unreasonable demands and settlement proposals. Each delay drained more time, energy, and money. It was clear she wasn't just bitter about the divorce. She was furious that I'd moved on. Her resentment festered, filling every conversation and every legal interaction with a venom I hadn't known she was capable of. And yet, Sophie was steadfast. She never complained about the drama that Rachel dragged us into. Even when I vented about another missed court date or a last-minute cancellation from Rachel's side, Sophie would just listen, nod, and then remind me of all the good that was still in my life. She didn't just tolerate the mess, she embraced it, determined not to let Rachel's bitterness tarnish what we were building. Our connection grew deeper with every passing day. I would send her little notes tucked into the pages of the books she lent me, and she'd surprise me with recommendations that were eerily perfect. We shared an ease and a trust that felt like a revelation. For the first time in years, I was genuinely happy, and I began to picture a future with Sophie. A future that felt like freedom and possibility. Then one perfect Saturday afternoon, everything fell apart. It was a chilly autumn evening. Sophie and I had just spent the day together, savoring the simple joy of each other's company. We'd gotten lunch at this cute little cafe, gone shopping, and were now walking back to her car, joking about what movie to watch that night. We were in the mall parking lot, laughing about a cheesy horror movie she'd convinced me to watch last weekend, when I heard the roar of an engine behind us. Before I could fully register the sound, I felt a surge of adrenaline as a car hurtled straight toward us. I barely had time to pull Sophie out of the way before the car clipped her leg. The sickening crunch of bone echoed through the lot, followed by Sophie's scream, sharp and agonized. She collapsed onto the pavement and I knelt beside her, trying to shield her with my body. It took me a moment to realize what was happening. The car that had hit us was reversing, its tires screeching as it lined up for another attempt. I recognized that car, and then I saw the driver. It was Rachel. My mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the depth of her hatred. She had tracked us, waited, and deliberately tried to run us down. This wasn't an accident, this was an attack. I managed to drag Sophie behind a nearby SUV, trying to keep her safe as Rachel's car smashed into the vehicles around us. She was relentless, reversing and gunning it again, shattering windshields, crunching metal, each failed attempt heightening her rage. I looked down at Sophie, her face twisted in pain, her leg bent at a sickening angle, and a fire ignited within me. This woman who had once been my wife, the woman I'd trusted and built a life with, was now trying to kill me and the person I loved. The sound of sirens finally broke through the chaos. As people gathered, shouting and recording the scene, Rachel stumbled out of the car, her face contorted with a venomous mix of hatred and jealousy. She started toward us, her heels clicking on the pavement with each furious step. Before she could reach us, a man in the crowd, someone built like a linebacker, grabbed her, holding her back. She fought him, her wild eyes fixed on me and Sophie, screaming obscenities that echoed through the parking lot. I held Sophie close, feeling the horror of what had just happened sink into my bones. Rachel was arrested on the spot, handcuffed and thrown into the back of a police car, still shouting, her words a twisted symphony of blame and bitterness. She kept yelling about betrayal, accusing me of ruining her life. The delusion was staggering. Here she was, the woman who had lied, cheated, and tried to kill, claiming she was the victim. The paramedics arrived and loaded Sophie into the ambulance. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with tears, but she managed a weak smile as they closed the doors, reaching out to touch my hand one last time before they drove off. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, police statements, and court hearings. Sophie's leg was badly broken, and she faced months of painful recovery and grueling physical therapy. Every day, I sat beside her hospital bed, guilt gnawing at me for bringing this nightmare into her life. But Sophie, in her resilient way, just held my hand, refusing to let me take on the blame. "Rachel is the only one responsible for this," she'd say, her voice steady despite the pain. "And she'll pay for it." The district attorney's office didn't waste any time. They had all the evidence they needed. Security footage from multiple angles capturing Rachel stalking us, circling the parking lot like a predator. There were countless witnesses and cell phone recordings, and the DA was confident we'd see justice served. The trial was harrowing. Watching Rachel in the courtroom, dressed in her sharp, lawyer-approved attire, trying to look remorseful, was a sickening farce. The prosecution laid out every grim detail of her actions, painting a picture of a calculated, premeditated attack. They showed footage of her parking, watching us, then circling, until she finally gunned the engine and aimed straight for Sophie. The jury watched in stunned silence, their faces filled with a mix of horror and disgust. Sophie took the stand with a strength that left me in awe. She recounted the attack in painful detail, describing the terror she'd felt as Rachel's car sped toward us, the agony of her broken leg, the desperation as I'd dragged her to safety. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, and as she stepped down, I could see the resolve in the jurors' faces. Rachel was found guilty on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment. The sentence was 12 years, a sentence that felt maddeningly short given the horror she'd unleashed. The judge, while condemning Rachel's actions, cited her lack of prior offenses and claimed her remorse was genuine. The words rang hollow in my ears. Watching Rachel get carted off, knowing she'd be free in a decade, felt like a bitter pill to swallow. But the silver lining was that once the criminal trial was over, the divorce went through in a flash. Rachel had forfeited any chance of alimony, assets, or any share of my retirement. The judge made it clear that Rachel had earned herself nothing but her prison cell. Sophie recovered slowly, her strength inspiring me every step of the way. After months of physical therapy, she finally regained her full mobility. Watching her walk without a limp for the first time filled me with a gratitude I can't describe. We moved into a new apartment downtown, far from the shadows of my old life, a place filled with light and laughter and the promise of a fresh start. We still visited that bookstore, still shared book recommendations and late-night discussions, but there was a new layer to our bond, a resilience forged in the fires of everything we'd survived together. One evening, as we sat on our balcony overlooking the city lights, Sophie turned to me with a quiet smile. "You know, this isn't the life I pictured for myself," she said, "but I wouldn't trade it for anything." I took her hand, holding it tightly as I looked out over the city, thinking of the twists and turns that had brought us here. Neither would I. Today, Sophie and I are planning a future together. A future built on honesty, love, and the quiet strength we found in each other. Rachel's shadow may still linger, but it no longer controls us. We're free to move forward, unburdened by the past, ready to embrace whatever comes next. In the end, I found the love I never thought possible. It didn't come in the way I'd expected or wanted, but it's more than I could have hoped for. And for anyone out there struggling, take it from me. There's always a way out, and sometimes the best things find us when we least expect them. Commentary time. This story is an intense journey through betrayal, survival, and ultimately rediscovering trust and love. OP's experience paints a heartbreaking picture of how a seemingly perfect life can unravel when a partner's hidden resentment and toxic behavior come to light. It's a story that reminds us of the importance of trusting your gut, even when everything on the surface seems fine. Rachel's betrayal and violent actions took OP to the depths of fear and disbelief, showing just how devastatingly far anger and obsession can push someone who feels they've lost control. Sophie's presence brings a sense of healing and peace, contrasting beautifully against the chaos and trauma of OP's past relationship. Her resilience and empathy are remarkable, standing by him even as Rachel's actions disrupt their newfound happiness. Sophie's strength highlights how real love is about partnership and perseverance, especially in moments of profound adversity. Through her, OP finds not only solace but a renewed belief in love built on understanding and mutual respect. The aftermath of Rachel's actions also underscores the importance of recognizing when to walk away. Sometimes, no matter how much effort we put in, certain relationships can't be saved. OP's journey shows that leaving behind a toxic relationship can ultimately lead to personal growth and a deeper, healthier love. His experience serves as a powerful reminder. Letting go of what no longer serves us may just open the door to something profoundly better. Have you ever faced a relationship or situation that forced you to choose between holding on and letting go? Share your experiences in the comments below, and let's support one another on our journeys of resilience and healing. If this story resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell so you never miss an inspiring story. Let's come together to celebrate new beginnings and the strength it takes to build them.